Hi, I'm Mike Saporito, and I'd like to welcome you to the Social Law Library here. Come on up. It's great to have all of you here today, and there's obviously an awful lot of excitement and interest in this topic, and we're very happy to be co-sponsoring with the Cannabis Control Commission. Come on. This is the third or fourth program I've done with Britta and Kay. Always a pleasure to work with them, and I hope you'll find this to be a very informative session. We do expect a full house, so if you could all just sit down and get ready, that would be great. A couple of quick things. There's one restroom off to the back in the kitchen. There's another around from the room where you came in, and there's two more in the main reading room if you go out through the library. There are evaluations on your desk. Sorry, I couldn't put desks in today. We don't have enough room. There's an evaluation on your chair. If you fill that out, there's a basket right as you leave. We'd be happy to see those and share them with the panelists. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand off to Britta McBride, and we'll be on our way. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. I am Britta McBride. I am one of the Cannabis Control Commissioners, and I'm also the chair of this forum, and I wanted to say thank you for coming today, and we appreciate you joining us for this conversation. So these remarks are going to be very brief so that we can get on with the panels. The reason that we are here, the reason that I'm here, and that I wanted to pull this together in conjunction with the Social Law Library and MMA can probably best be summed up by the conversation I had with Tom Moses when I called him to see if he would be a participant on this panel, and before I even got the words out of my mouth, he said, "Yup, I want to be part of it. I already respond to phone calls probably a few times a week, and it would be great to be able to sit down and share the experience of Hudson." So it was with that in mind that we pulled this together in order to really share information and be able to illuminate some of the questions and some of the issues that are being talked about. So it's a timely conversation, right? As of today, we have 3 stores that are open in the Commonwealth, with several more in the hopper. And several municipalities have moratoria that are going to be expiring at the end of this month, which could make for a really interesting 2019 in terms of town meetings and conversations that are going to be happening at the municipal level. And in addition to that, as folks may have heard, we are going to be launching in earnest the application for our social equity program tomorrow, which is fantastic news, and we're really, really excited about at the commission level. And so all of these pieces kind of come together and drive forward this conversation. Incidentally, on your chairs, you will find a copy of the local equity guidance that the commission has put together. This is one of many guidances that are available on our website that are helpful to municipalities, helpful to operators, and we hope that you will use as a resource. In addition to answering the questions today with the panel, that those might provide you with some additional information. So we know that in many municipalities, questions about whether and how to move forward remain. And some may be answered today. Some may be part of an evolving conversation about how cannabis commerce fits into our communities. And so on your chairs, you'll find a note card and pen. If you have a question, please write it down. Commission staff will be circulating to collect the questions and provide them to our moderators. One note, and I think this is something that maybe the municipal officials in the room will appreciate, this is an educational forum for you. It's not a formal commission meeting, therefore the commission can't deliberate, and so as such, we can't respond to questions, we can't ask questions. If you have questions for commissioners, all of whom I think are in the room at this point in time, you can have a sidebar with us, but because of the open meeting law, we're not allowed to sort of stand up and opine about things in the forum. Finally, I wanted to say thank you to some people. First, to the people who are on these panels. We understand that this is one of 1,000 issues that municipalities are dealing with, but this is a really important and timely topic, and having officials that are willing to come and share their experiences is extremely important for furthering this conversation. I think that it's probably fair to say that municipal government is probably the least glamorous but also the purest form of government, because the decisions that you are making every day touch the people in your communities. And so it's particularly important that we're hearing this perspective. Second, I wanted to say thank you to our hosts and co-sponsors, the Social Law Library. Commissioner Kay Doyle is right down front with me here, and it is very safe to say that without the social law library, the regulations that we put together last December, the first draft, might not have gotten done, because this is where a lot of that research and drafting went on. And Michael Saporito is a joy to work with. He helped put together this forum. We were talking to another venue that fell through, and they readily stepped into the void and said, absolutely, let's host this here. So thank you so much to the Social Law Library for being that resource for us. I also need to thank Brittany Franklin from the Mass Municipal Association, who helped me conceptualize some of these panels and did initial outreach. She has been a great partner, and we really appreciate her help, as well as the help of the MMA's social media team and communications team that helped get the word out. Finally, I want to acknowledge the folks from our communications department. Mary Alice Gill, Cedric Sinclair, and Martine Russell have been phenomenal in putting this together and helping us get the word out, and they deserve a lot of credit for pulling this together. So it's with that in mind that I want to turn this over to Jeff Beckwood, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Municipal Association, who's going to be moderating our first panel. We will probably talk for about an hour and 20 minutes and then take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the second panel. So with that, Jeff, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. On behalf of the Massachusetts Municipal Association and local officials across the Commonwealth, we want to express our appreciation to Commissioner McBride. We see Commissioner Doyle there, the Cannabis Control Commission in general, and the Social Law Library for hosting this important forum. We are very pleased that a recording of this is being made, and we'll be posting this on our website in addition to other, we imagine the Cannabis Control Commission will have it on its website and other places in order so that this forum will actually have many more attendees than the already impressive group that's here today. And then also I want to express my personal appreciation to Brittany Franklin of the MMA staff. Brittany's back there. She's in her first year on the MMA staff as a senior legislative analyst, and she's a real fantastic addition to the staff, and she's our marijuana lead in terms of policy and has done great work on this. And of course, we want to say thank you to the 5 panelists, distinguished local officials, leaders who are here, who will share some of their stories and their experiences with you regarding the rollout of this new industry in Massachusetts. This first panel is a conversation with municipal leaders. These 5 leaders will talk from their perspectives of their experience in their communities as the industry is coming to their locality. What we'd like to do is to make sure that there's time to address your questions. As Britta said, there are cards for you to write down your questions, and they'll be sort of grouped together, and we hope to have as much time as possible. The end time for this session will be 2:35 sharp, so that there can be a 10-minute break between this panel and the next panel. And so each of the panelists here will ask to spend a maximum of 8 to 10 minutes telling their stories. We'll go down the line. I'll introduce everyone briefly in a second. And then we'll have plenty of time to be able to address some questions and potentially have a conversation among the panelists here, recognizing that this is just a part of the first wave of discussions on this topic and the experience that municipalities have had that's taking place. Approximately 70% of communities in Massachusetts have either directly or indirectly decided to go forward with cannabis commerce. In that context, only a small percentage has actually voted to ban commercial sales, and that means that commercial sales will be taking place in communities that have 85 to 90% of the state's population, which means there are lots of opportunities for not only industry to mature, but for municipalities to deal with lots of different questions, issues, and challenges through the local government decision-making process, which is at its basic level the most process-driven and citizen-driven levels of government in New England and in the rest of the country, which means that these aren't questions or issues that are easily dispatched with. They involve a lot of participation, a lot of discussion, and a lot of sort of inefficient deliberative sessions. But that's just the way local government is and the way local government makes decisions that citizens have confidence in. So we're going to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about how their community has arrived at where it is. What do local officials anticipate the big issues or questions will be, or the impacts over the next several years? What priorities are important in terms of reviewing potential licensees? Is there a local vetting process? How is that developed? What concerns came to the forefront and how did you deal with those? What's your advice to potential establishments looking to locate in your community? And also, what's your advice to other communities? And I think that just telling your stories will answer a lot of those questions, and then we'll dive a little deeper in the second part. We're very privileged. What I'll do is I'll just say who's here on the panel, why they're here briefly, and then we'll go down from your right to left, from my my left to further left, I guess. We'll proceed. Mayor David Narkowitz of Northampton represents the first community that opened a retail establishment, and he also was one of the very first customers, if not the first customer. Mayor Alex Morse of Holyoke. His city has been at the forefront of discussions of developing the industry and serving as a hub for the industry here in Massachusetts. Tom Moses is the executive assistant for the town of Hudson. That's the town manager, where a final retail license was granted last week. Ed Abrams is the vice chair of the Great Barrington Select Board, where a final retail license was granted last week. And Thatcher Keyser is the chief operating officer of the city of Framingham, formerly the mayor of Amesbury. I think the order has changed a little bit from the way I had it written down. Thatcher is actually in between Tom and Ed, but we'll proceed down the line. Our first speaker is Mayor David Narkowitz. Welcome. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for sharing your experience.
Thank you. It's great to be with you this morning. I'm David Narkowitz, Mayor of the City of Northampton. For those of you who haven't been to Northampton, we're a city in the Pioneer Valley, a city of about 28,500. We're a very diverse and very progressive community, nestled in a 5-college area, home to Smith College. If you've been to our downtown, we have a very active and vibrant downtown with live music venues and local art, restaurants, etc. So when it comes to cannabis, the two ballot questions, the two ballot initiatives in the state, my community voted on the issue of medical marijuana 75% in the affirmative, and when it came to adult use, nearly 70% in the affirmative. So it's fairly clear to me as the chief executive where my citizens stood in terms of this new industry. So working with our city council and our planning board and our other regulatory agencies, we have tried to put in place a very thoughtful, I would say a very progressive, and I would say not restrictive process, and I'll sort of describe that. We have put in place zoning, for example, that essentially treats cannabis like any other industry in the city. There's no exception. Manufacturing and cultivation occurs in the zones where we allow other manufacturing activities. Retail is allowed in any of our retail zones of the city. We relaxed the buffer zones as we had done on medical from 500 to 200. We don't require a special permit if you're in a zone that allows retail and you want to open a coffee shop or a dry cleaners or a cannabis retail shop, you will go through the same process. We did not set up any separate licensure process in the city. I've reviewed the state's licensure process and am confident in how extensive it is. So we really are applying more of a local process, zoning, building, and then obviously meeting with the mayor and doing a community outreach meeting. So when we have a prospective person come to our community, typically I'm the first person that they meet with. We then have them meet with our zoning officials to make sure whatever location that they've secured meets our zoning requirements and is in a location where it's an allowed use. We then encourage them, well, they not encourage, it's the law, to have their neighborhood meeting. We then typically have a follow-up discussion to see if there are any issues related to that neighborhood meeting, and then we execute a host community agreement. I can tell you that of the neighborhood meetings we've held, probably on the order of 70 to 80% of them, there hasn't been really anyone who's come to them, frankly. No one has come. We've had a few initial ones where people came from the public, but again, if you've been to Northampton, our retail zones are quite separate from our residential zones, so there's not a real lot of overlap. So we haven't had a huge turnout or huge concern from members of our community about individual neighborhood meetings that have been held. We developed a template for our host community agreement. It's very basic. It covers the essential items that we wanted to have in an agreement, which is largely about maintaining good communication between the municipality and the applicant, especially with our police department, in terms of security and any kinds of traffic or parking issues that may arise. We are availing ourselves of the 3% mitigation in all of our agreements. And from there, we execute the agreement, and then they're on to the the rest of the licensing process with the Cannabis Commission. So in terms of our experience, obviously, we had the third medical dispensary in the state that opened in Northampton, so we have a little bit of an experience to understand what potential impacts there are. And I can tell you there really have been no major impacts, negative, in terms of traffic, in terms of public safety, in terms of crime, any of those issues with the medical dispensary. Obviously, we had some traffic issues with the retail dispensary that just opened on November 20th. But in terms of our experience from the medical side, it's been positive. The operator has been very involved in the community. They're a member of our Chamber of Commerce. They've been attending neighborhood meetings and been willing to meet with anyone in the community that has questions about their operation. As we moved into the retail side, we've gotten a lot of interest from folks from around the country, frankly, who are interested in either doing retail, cultivation, manufacturing. We have a lot of old mill buildings, which are ideal for manufacturing. So to date, we've executed 14 host community agreements. We have 7 that are looking to do retail in our community. We have 3 doing medical dispensaries, 2 in manufacturing, 1 in cultivation, 1 in extraction. I should also say to you that as part of the zoning package that I submitted to the City Council and to the Planning Board, we did not implement caps on the number of retail establishments. Again, getting back to my earlier point about treating this like any other business, we don't have caps on any of our other businesses. I'm actually an opponent of the caps on liquor licenses that exist in Massachusetts, and I've been fighting to eliminate those for years. It's an arcane throwback to post-prohibition area, and frankly, it's harmful from an economic development perspective for a city like Northampton that wants to have a hotel or a restaurant open, and we have to literally get an act at the legislature to try to get them a license. So I was not in favor of the caps, and my planning board and city council agreed, so our zoning does not include caps. In terms of the opening of Netta and the retail dispensary, yes, we've had a lot of interest, a lot of visitors to Northampton. We did a lot of pre-planning between public safety and the operator. They've been very responsible in terms of renting additional parking, working to hire additional police. And we've had long lines and we've had lots of traffic, but again, we've had no issues. And so business has been brisk. We're hoping that as more dispensaries and more retail establishments open, including one right next to us in East Hampton soon, that some of the lines will taper off. But I guess my main takeaway or my main message to you is that Northampton has very much embraced this new industry. We consider ourselves very open to it and open for business. And I hope that if there are folks who are interested in getting into the industry, that you'll come check out Northampton. It's a great city, and we think it's got a lot of great synergy in terms of it's already a major destination in Western Massachusetts. And so we see it as a natural fit with all the other attractions and cultural life that we have in the city of Northampton.
Thank you. Very nicely done. An advertisement for Northampton in addition to the story.
I'm a mayor, Jeff.
Yes,
Come on.
exactly. And so on for another advertisement. I suspect we have Mayor Alex Morse, who's done a lot of thinking and a lot of work on this issue. Mayor, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. Just on the outset, I do want to say I always feel a bit uncomfortable when I'm on a panel with just 5 white men, so I think in the future we can do a better job of diversifying the voices from municipal government. So I need to up Mayor Narkowitz's pitch about Holyoke as to why it's so important. If you're not familiar with Holyoke, I'm just about 10 minutes south of Northampton in western Massachusetts, about 90 miles west. I was the first and I think only mayor to publicly support legalization back in 2016 for a number of reasons. And I know if you're in this room, you're likely a strong supporter of the industry. And I saw it as it was a little bit of an uncomfortable topic in the city. About 59% of voters voted in favor in 2016, so a pretty clear majority. But I think a lot of that was a testament to our team's sort of educational conversation that we had with residents in the community. And I have with us today Marcos Marrero, our Director of Planning and Economic Development, and Sarah Zimbler, who's one of our development specialists that's really focused on this industry. And we laugh sometimes because when I took office 7 years ago or so, never did we think that cannabis would be one of our main drivers for economic development and workforce development in our community. And here we are, and we now have a crop that has a high return on investment today that's really leading us towards a renaissance in our former mill district. So we're a city of about 40,000 people. We were built to be able to have up to 55, 60,000 residents. We're the paper city, the first city in the country to make paper. And so we want to go from the paper city to the rolling paper city. And we have about 1.5 million square feet of vacant mill space in the downtown, and a significant chunk of that now is under option by cannabis companies in particular. And so, unlike Northampton, my administration had proposed a pretty progressive, expansive zoning regulation for siting of whether it be a dispensary, a cultivation, laboratory, and I will say, it required our council and our council's members and their opinions required us to be a little bit more compromising in terms of what type of ordinance we could get passed in the city of Holyoke. I don't think we have as progressive a legislative branch in Holyoke than you have in the city of Northampton. But despite that, I think we've been able to make a lot of progress with the zoning ordinance. So currently, any use is allowed in our industrial general zone of the city. Unfortunately for us, that encompasses a vast array of our canal district, our art and innovation district in the city, and so it hasn't hampered the cannabis industry and business proponents coming into the city in that sense. Right now, we do have GTI or Rise Holdings cultivating on Appleton Street in the city, cultivating all of their products for their dispensary that is now open in Amherst. And they have plans for a retail recreational dispensary on Race Street on the canal in Holyoke as well. We have about 30 companies actively interested in the city. We have about 21 of those with an option agreement on a property in the community. We have 5 special permits approved for a combination of cultivation and retail dispensing in the community as well. We also do have a special permit process, and so while that does provide protections for the city, it does require the companies, the proponents, to go before the legislative branch after they get a recommendation from the planning board. And we're very involved in those processes, vetting and making sure that all companies are set up for success by the time they get before the city council. And so if councilors have particular questions about their impact, the planning board and my office have already thoroughly vetted their proposals. The special permit conditions that we see the council putting on the companies are relatively standard. They've been the same conditions on every company, and so there's been consistency in that sense. We have a commitment of 25% of the employees at the company to be Holyoke residents. And while we understand that requirement is debatable by some applicants, we do think it's a notable goal to make sure that you hire folks from Holyoke. And if you know anything about the city of Holyoke, we're about 50% Latino, mostly of Puerto Rican descent. Many of our residents have been harmed by prohibition and the war on drugs over the last several decades, and so we think it is incumbent upon the companies that come to Holyoke to really be purposeful about engaging the residents in our community. And on top of that, we also know we don't want to put a special permit condition on a company without also helping make sure that we have a trained workforce of Holyoke residents ready to take those jobs. And so we were really proud to partner with organizations here in the state, get approval by the Cannabis Control Commission to work with Holyoke Community College and C3RN on a program specifically to train residents of Holyoke and Western Mass to take jobs in this industry. And so while we are encouraging companies to hire Holyoke residents, at the same time we're also making sure that we have a supply of residents that are ready to take those jobs in the industry. I will say overall I've differed from many municipal officials around the state, going back years, even the Mass Municipal Association. As a member now and a mayor, I thought that a lot of my colleagues were pushing for a little too much local control, because we see a lot of parochial mayors and city council members really have their head in the sand about what cannabis is. And I think, even in communities where you see a majority of residents deserve legal access to be at medical or recreational marijuana, you have, members of select boards and whatnot that are trying to prohibit others from exercising, I think, their civil rights to be able to have access to this industry. And so I've differed with the MMA in that sense. I think we need to be a little bit more like the licensing of liquor license, where there's more state authority, it's more centralized, and you remove the politics from making sure that people have access to this industry in particular. And so that's the conversation that I'm excited to have. I always enjoy the opportunity to speak with other mayors or council members, because anybody opposed to or anybody against or anybody who doesn't use marijuana should be in favor of a tax-regulated and safe system that allows us to address the negative consequences of marijuana use, but also have economic and workforce benefits for our communities. And so it's safer and it's better for everyone in that sense. But now that it's legal, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that legalization doesn't just benefit some of us in our communities, but all of us. And so I found it to be a good experience. We're looking forward to seeing what it has in store for the city of Holyoke and for our residents. And, when people ask about, what are your major concerns, I think, embedded in that question is the assumption that this industry should be held to a much higher standard than the average business in the community, which to some extent they should be. But until we start having conversations about the dangerous substances you have at the local Rite Aid or CVS, which are much more dangerous than anything you'll find at a dispensary, I think we need to make sure we're consistent in our language and the standards that we're holding these companies to in our community. So again, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. And next we'll go, according to the way people are sitting, we'll have Ed Abrams, the Vice Chair of the Great Barrington Select Board, talk about the issues in his community.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a commercial for Great Barrington, because a lot of you may not know where we are. Way at the end of the state, about as far as you can go without being in New York. You should come visit. You should plan to stay. If you do, it is not uncommon to meet someone who came to Great Barrington to go hiking and is still living there years later, me included. We are a town of 7,000 people, about 4,000 voters who voted almost 2-to-1 in favor of legalization. So I also took it upon my being elected as my responsibility to make that happen. I had spent, before being elected, 2 years working really hard to keep my teenage daughter and other teenagers from alcohol, marijuana, other drugs. The fact that I am now the point person on the select board to bring this, the irony and the hypocrisy is not lost on my daughter. But that was sort of the point. I was ambivalent. I voted in favor of legalization, but it wasn't a hearty endorsement because to me there were a lot of questions that weren't answered. The beauty of the CCC process is that they've been answered. And as far as we were concerned, it's ready to go. We lean on the CCC regulations a lot. So one of the, they weren't applicants yet, one of the businesses in our town that was interested in starting a retail operation called me to say they had left several messages with town hall, hadn't heard back. I called the town manager who said, yeah, we don't really have a process yet. And this was probably weeks, maybe not quite 2 months before the CCC was going to start accepting applications. So I said, what does it take to make a process? And we dove into it. So our town is run, other than a pretty small staff, by volunteers like me. I'm really impressed listening to two of you at how well we did as amateurs with very similar processes. So the planning board got to work on a zoning bylaw, which puts no limits on retail any different than any other retail, with the exception of the school, proximity to a school, and we've also reduced ours, partly because there was a school in the downtown, and if we hadn't reduced it, then half of the downtown, half of one street would be okay and the other half wouldn't. We also reduced it, I think, to 200 feet. We had an argument between the select board and the planning board about cultivation, which we settled with a special permit process. Cultivation is allowed pretty much where farming is allowed. We're a right-to-farm community. But cultivation isn't like farming in that it's indoors, very likely. It's with lights, it's with security. So we made all cultivation special permit. There were still questions we don't know the answer to. To me, one of the biggest is, what does it smell like? What does a warehouse full of that smell like? So that's something we can control a little bit. It hasn't come up yet because nobody has applied for that. So immediately upon coming up with the criteria for a host agreement, we had 4 applicants. And there was a fair amount of panic in town of people saying, oh my God, we're getting overrun, we're going to be Pot Town USA. We do, because we're so close to New York, we get an awful lot of tourists from New York City. This will probably bring more. They're coming from a place where it isn't legal. We actually have something in our host agreement that requires retail or establishments to have a sign reminding people if it's not legal in their state. They should know that. People are worried that we're going to be known for this. We haven't limited, some of the communities around us have limited it to not in the downtown core. We didn't do that. Anywhere retail is allowed, we allow it. I thought we were racing. I thought this is going to be legal. I'm looking around, there are a lot of little towns around us. We have the main shopping area, but there are other towns. We want to compete. So I'm rushing to work to have a host agreement so we can start this process. You know, the gun goes off, the CCC's accepting applications, and I look around and nobody else has host agreements. Everybody's passed moratoriums. Consequently, we're getting the first retail license in the area, or one of the first 2. I think that's wonderful. I think it's great that we have been able to look to the other communities that have one and prepare. We're prepared with a parking and traffic plan for the first few weekends they're open. But it was really important for us not to be an obstacle. Like the other communities, we look at this like any other business. And like any other business, we want to welcome them. This one has an added benefit in that 6% of sales go to the town. The other businesses don't do that. It was commented that there are more dangerous products being sold. You can buy opioids right next to a church in our town at the Rite Aid pharmacy. And nobody has a problem. One of the 4 applicants, I also want to say, immediately there were 4 applicants, and people panicked and started talking about putting limits, and there's still talk about limits, which I suspect will come up at our town meeting in May. We haven't had another applicant yet. No one else has come forward after those 4. One of them is renting a storefront and will be opening between 2 toy stores, within a few storefronts of 2 toy stores on our main street. And people are constantly saying, isn't that crazy? And I keep asking why. Other than the fact, so I spoke at a high school before we put our zoning into effect, and I spoke to these students against destructive decisions. And so these are kids who at least say they're not using drugs. And I said to them, we're looking at regulations. Do you think it's a good idea to allow sales next to a high school? And they were quiet. And then one of them raised her hand and she said, I'm not sure why, but it doesn't seem like a good idea. That's the only answer I have for the toy store. And that's the answer we've been getting. I'm not sure why it doesn't seem like a good idea to put marijuana next to a toy store. So we all know you won't see the product from the window. The name of the store won't give away what's inside. Children aren't allowed inside. And they can't give away the product. All of those things liquor stores can do. You can bring your child into a liquor store. You can bring your child into Rite Aid while you buy opioids with a prescription. So we just aren't worried about it. Well, I shouldn't say we. The town has voted not to be worried about it. We'll see what happens in May. There very likely will be some backlash. We're a very small town, as I said. We all know each other. We legislate from the town meeting. In Great Barrington, starting in 2 weeks, you'll be able to buy marijuana. You won't be able to buy water in a plastic bottle. We took care of that. So thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. I'm only going to use one of these actually now today. You've said that. Thanks very much for that perspective. And again, another advertisement. So now we have Thatcher Keyser, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the City of Framingham. He's formerly the mayor of Amesbury, and way back, he actually was on the MMA legislative staff. So he's an alum of our organization as well. So Thatcher, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, and I'll try to surprise you and stay under the time limit. So as Jeff said, I am the Chief Operating Officer for the City of Framingham. And as you may or may not know, up until the end of last year, Framingham was the largest town in America. And then it voted a charter change and became a city. So on January 1st of this year, it officially became a city, led by Dr. Yvonne Spicer, the first African-American woman to be elected as mayor in Massachusetts, and who has done an outstanding job of being the first mayor of Framingham. Interesting, kids are asked what should be on the new city seal. Overwhelmingly, they want Mayor Spicer on the city seal. Decision to be made at some point. What's interesting for me, as Jeff said, being a former mayor, and I'll talk a little bit about this issue during that time, but Framingham is going through this huge transition. I was hired as the Chief Operating Officer. I have 12 division heads reporting to me, and I report to the mayor. Think of it in the private sector as a management buyout, new management come in, trying to figure out what do you do, how do you do it, how do you work with others. So we're going through that whole transition as a community, and you layer this issue on top of it. So it's been an interesting time for the city of Framingham. Framingham voted on the ballot question 54% to 46% in favor, which is a critical factor in the deliberations of all the decisions that needed to be made going forward. The city has, in the last year, created a task force in order to write all of the zoning ordinances and the general ordinances in order to adjust to this new dynamic of having this industry. Framingham did have a active host community agreement with an RMD, Temescal Wellness, that is currently operating in the city. And then we've recently done 2 host community agreements for testing facilities, MCR Labs, which is open and active, and EVO Labs, which I think is just going through the last hoops through the commission. So there's some activity already going on. What's been interesting for me in this whole subject, for one, I just retired 38 years, Air Force, Air National Guard. I was a traditional guardsman. As a squadron commander, I've had to discharge airmen for the use of marijuana. There was no wiggle room. There was no, the Air Force, sometimes they would have some tolerance, and other times they wouldn't, I guess, depending on how recruitment was going. But I remember, losing some really good airmen. They were college students, and they had some fun on the weekend, and they got hit with the random test, and they were done. And even if you were allowed to stay in, you probably lose your security clearance, which would knock you out of a lot of jobs. So that's the mindset I've come from for so many years. When I was mayor of Amesbury, I was in office 2006 to 2013 when the medicinal marijuana came around. The big issue in Amesbury was the first cultivators looking to get letters of support, hopefully, or at least letters of non-opposition. I issued 2 letters of non-opposition and got killed, eviscerated in the paper for allowing pot farms to take over Amesbury. I say how far we have come. I know for me personally, with like I said, with the military mindset that I walked into the issue, spending time with folks in the industry, sitting down and learning about it, and having a clear understanding of the facts of what this issue is all about rather than the perception that's out there. And so that allowed me to issue the letters of non-opposition and take the heat as mayor. Moving on more recently, in Framingham, using military terminology, we are in between the flash and the bang of opening up shops for recreational use in Framingham, meaning the city has gone through the process of zoning, general ordinances, putting all the pieces in place, and if you know Framingham, Route 9 runs right through the center. Generally speaking, the zoning is along Route 9, east and west, a gap in the middle. It's limited to that. At a planning conference, folks, we can get into the whole mechanics of how that decision was made, but that's what we have. We are now in the process of what we've created is a marijuana advisory team. I am the chair of that. I am the generalist. I am not an expert on any of the particular parts of this, but I help orchestrate, a whole team of experts in different areas where we have created an application process, an online through our website application process where folks fill out the online form, upload the pertinent documents, and hit submit. And that starts the process where the marijuana advisory team, we meet, and it's modeled after a planning board technical team reviewing development sites where we have the division heads and representatives from all the major functional areas of the city review the applications, and then we've been bringing the applicants in. We just started yesterday with the first 2 applicants meeting with us, 45-minute meeting, allowing them to do, initial pitch, explanation, and then open up to Q&A so that the different functional areas can ask pertinent questions of how the applicants are going to handle certain aspects. One of the big issues is going to be with the shops along Route 9, heavy traffic, lots of traffic flow. The sites, generally speaking, are going to be tight, traffic and parking-wise. The concern of neighbors and others is the impediment of traffic flow and parking and people not going through neighborhoods and, all the issues that I think were played out on the news for the initial shops opening up seems to be what is concerning neighbors and such at this point. Our hope is, through this process of sitting down with the applicants and having these conversations, look at the site, is to mitigate as much as possible. Our feeling is, as more and more facilities open up, it'll disperse the crowds a bit. For the industry folks, they want to be the first ones in and capture that whole market share. From the municipal perspective, we want our market share, but for the sake of logistics, sort of disperse the traffic flow and all that as much as possible. The other highlight I would talk about a little bit for Framingham, as a new city in a whole change form of government, what's been a bit of interest in Framingham is there are new relationships, new power structure as you go from a board of selectmen to a city council mayor. And so we've been having our battles, as any mayor up here will tell you the stories. What's interesting for Framingham, this issue of dealing with creating the zoning, creating the ordinances, creating all this process has been, I think, one of the things that has worked well between the administration and the city council. It really worked as far as government, being transparent, taking a lot of input from folks, a lot of public hearings, crafting, making lots of compromises to make this whole process work. It worked really well in Framingham. There's a lot of noise during the process, but the end result worked, and everyone was equally satisfied to an extent to have a process and work. And as I said, we're between the flash and the bang. The applications are in. We're actively reviewing them, and we will. The advisory team is to make recommendations to the mayor as to what organizations to enter into host community agreements with so that they can continue on the process. We have somewhere, the count keeps changing, I think 8 or 10 applicants for retail, and I think 2 for cultivation. Some applications are complete and robust, and other applications are probably going to get kicked back for more information that's missing. So how many actually jump into the review process is yet to be seen. We're trying to move quickly and hope probably this spring, I'm going to guess, is when the first shops will have complete their processes and open their doors in Framingham. So that's our experience, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Thatcher. And a sign of his political acumen, he actually made an advertisement for his boss, which is very shrewd. We appreciate your being on the panel. So then our final presenter, and then we'll take your questions, is Tom Moses, the Executive Assistant or Town Manager of the Town of Hudson.
Okay, I'm not a mayor, never have been a mayor, so my talk will be a little shorter. Hudson's somewhat unique in this group because it's a very traditionally conservative community. The home of Paul Salucci, we're in the middle of the state in a relatively conservative belt. And we're primarily blue-collar community, very homogeneous economically. There are very few poor people, very few rich people in town. But we are surrounded by affluence, with the exception of the city of Marlborough. Communities like Sudbury, Stowe, Bolton, Weston and Wayland are not far away, Northborough and Southborough. So that becomes important in a couple of philosophical discussions that we had early on. The first was, because we're a fairly conservative community, the ballot question for recreational or adult use marijuana passed by 52%. our Board of Selectmen quickly came to the realization that they weren't going to pursue any kind of moratorium or ban, not because of the logistic hurdles, because we were a yes community, but knowing that 80% voted in a national election, and that any decision that they made in opposition to that 52% would likely be a very small minority making the decisions for the majority of the town. The other issue that is somewhat unique on this panel, not necessarily with Great Barrington, is we're a town. And because we are conservative and business-oriented, we wanted to move quickly and get in front of this industry. But our legislative process happens once every 6 months, as opposed to every week or every 2 weeks. So we had to be thoughtful, and we had to be prepared to move quickly. So early on in 2014, we developed an overlay zone for medical marijuana. It turned out to be a great overlay zone down the road. It'll become evident why, but it was located right off of 495. We quickly had a number of applicants coming in, probably 1 or 2 a week. The district is fairly small. There isn't a whole lot of room there. We executed community host agreements with a couple. One since dropped out. It was a bigger corporation from Colorado. Temescal, who's been mentioned before, was one of the early applicants. We now have a second native son. Temescal is up and running with medical. They're approved for adult use, and we expect them to open for adult use shortly. Native Son is still building their site. They're near approval on both medical and adult use with the state. The second phase, since we wanted to get moving, was to develop an overlay zone for adult use. We made the decision to move fairly methodically and in baby steps, even though we wanted to be out front in the industry. So we established an overlay district with adult use that was exactly the same as the medical marijuana overlay district. Hopefully that'll avoid a lot of the traffic problems for several reasons. First of all, I agree, the more establishments that open up, the less concentrated the traffic will be. But our location of that district, very, very close to 495, will help keep the traffic from the rest of the town and concentrate it between the district and 495, which is probably less than half a mile. The other decision we made early on was to keep the retail establishments away from downtown. We have had extraordinary success in the last 5 to 10 years in building out a downtown area. We've become a dining destination. We've got a very intimate, walkable downtown, but we understand who we are. We're a conservative town. We're not a college town. We're not Northampton. We're not Framingham. And we felt it was better to locate these retail establishments outside of our downtown area and keep our downtown more family friendly. While I will agree with the rest of the panel, you don't see the product, you can't tell from the name, and sure, we also have liquor stores that are closer to schools. And while I may disagree with the conservative nature of the town philosophically, sometimes I wonder how I got hired there, we did consciously try to preserve the family-oriented nature of downtown. So the next step, I should back up a bit. When we brought the overlay district to the retail overlay district to town meeting, there was an interesting response from the 200 or so, 250 people at town meeting. They said, why can't we grow in town? Where's the cultivation? And so that ignited the move to create a separate overlay district for our cultivation and manufacturing. We don't have the room in the medical and the retail overlay district to accommodate the buildings necessary for cultivation, but we do have several underutilized industrial parks in town. So very quickly, we established those as overlay districts, and the floodgates opened up. We have been getting, probably 3 or 4 inquiries a week on cultivation. And last night, the town approved its first community host agreement for a cultivation facility. It's a fairly small one, 10,000 square feet, but we have another interested party who will likely go before the Board of Selectmen in less than a month with a much larger facility in a different industrial park. So we're very excited to be in the beginning of this very young industry, and at the same time preserve the nature of our town. One more aspect that makes, I think, Hudson particularly attractive for growers is we have a municipal light plant, municipal electricity, just like Holyoke does. But unlike Holyoke, we have the lowest electricity rates in the Commonwealth and among the lowest in all of New England. And as we all know, growing, this is my pitch.
I've noticed.
Growing is very, has an intensive electricity use. And we have a lot of capacity. The town's largest employer is the chip maker Intel. Intel has a large design facility, has about 900 to 1,000 employees, and they did have a manufacturing plant next to it. Well, the manufacturing plant closed and they raised the building. So that leaves us now with low water, sewer, and electricity rates and lots of capacity. So we have the ability to attract the cultivation industry. And that's Hudson's story.
Well, we noticed that that was a plug for plugging the industry into Hudson in an affordable way. So we do have some cards out there. If you have a question for the panel, please write them down, and folks will collect them, and then we'll see how many we can get to. I'll ask a first question while that's happening. Just to specifically, if each panelist could talk a little bit more about host community agreements and what the important factors are in terms of addressing those. I just do want to make a note that under Massachusetts law, cities and towns have general authority to negotiate on behalf of the residents and the citizens, and do this work in many other areas, including cable franchise agreements, agreements with telecommunications companies, entities that want to use the public rights of way, for example. So it's pretty common. Communities have a lot of experience, but host community agreements for cannabis, a new wrinkle in that. So it would be nice to just briefly go down the line and have each panelist talk about host community agreements and what the important factors were in addressing those for the community.
Well, first off, you can read copies of all 14 of the ones that we've executed. They're available on our website. You can check them out. again, as I said in my remarks, when we were developing it, we looked around to see what other sources were out there, what other communities had developed. And so we just tried to put together something that addressed the concerns we had in terms of ensuring good communication with the license holders. Again, good communication with our public safety. It laid out the terms around mitigation. Again, 3% is the mitigation level in all of our agreements. And beyond that, it's a very straightforward document, and we haven't had a lot of conversation in terms of applicants. Most folks have found it to be very reasonable and have been very quick to sign and get moving on their application process. So that's really our experience, but it's available if folks want to use it as a model or a template. That's it.
Great. Mayor?
Similar process in the city of Holyoke. I didn't mention it in the opening remarks, but we also have a standard template host community agreement. So one size fits all. I think the industry has really appreciated the fact that we're at the 3%. Everyone has the same agreement, and I know companies have been pretty happy about that. We have meetings in our office, and they tell us stories of similar conversations they've had with other local officials across the Commonwealth and how much easier and how friendly it is in Holyoke compared to other communities. That you have yes, we have the cheapest utility rates in Holyoke, abundant space, cheap cost of living, lower property values. It's a good place for investment, but for the industry in particular, in the political winds around it, I think companies first and foremost are looking for that political support, the support of the city or town to make sure that you're consistent and you're stable in your investment in a particular community. So I did bring copies of our host community agreement. It's pretty easy if anybody wants to sign one before we leave. And I do want to thank one of our former city solicitors, now works for the Cannabis Control Commission, Paul Payer. He didn't wear a suit when he worked for the city, but he's wearing a suit now. So thank you, Paul, for your work on the HCA as well. But it's been pretty standard, and all companies have enjoyed working with the city in that sense.
Great.
I went online, looked at a bunch of other host agreements I could find, probably both of yours. I cut and paste, sent it to the town's lawyer, and he made about $6,000 worth of changes, and nobody's complained about it. All four signed it as is.
So in Framingham, we have Petrini Associates as our city solicitor firm. Amanda Zaretti, who works for that firm, has been published in some local or Massachusetts legal publications in regard to the work in Framingham. Same message, pretty standard template, 3% on the impact. Philosophically, I believe a fee should represent true numbers, a fee, but 3% seems to be where, at least as we venture into the unknown, where it needs to be. When we did the host community agreements with the 2 testing labs, and we looked at the potential impacts on the municipalities, we could not identify anything that would be of significance, so we waived the fee. We didn't impose a 3% fee, but we kept language of a reopener that if there are impacts on the community that are unforeseen at this time, that we'll re-enter into discussions over implementing a fee should we need that. I think testing labs, the recreational is going to be a whole different story than the testing labs for obvious reasons that we all know. A couple of provisions that are important to the city, important to the mayor, is the local hire. We have, I guess I'd call it encouragement language to hire local and to hire diversity that reflects the community that we're in.
And my story is similar. Like any good town manager, I stole what I used from other communities. We actually got a couple of community host agreements, took the best parts from each of them, made a standard template. We use that as well. It's kind of a philosophy in town that we want to be easy to do business with. We have a single point of contact for the applicants that come in who will help walk them through all the regulatory boards, planning board, zoning board, any other board they need. We have a standard agreement as well, and same terms, 3% for the impact fee, local hiring preferences, et cetera. And once again, it was very important to create a level playing field for all businesses who want to be in this industry in Hudson.
Do you have any questions on index cards for this panel yet? So I'll do a filler and just say, what's your biggest surprise so far? And we'll do reverse order. So we'll start back down the end and come back. What's your biggest surprise?
The biggest surprise was the embrace of the industry by the conservative elements in town.
My biggest, should have started on the other end, but I did mention how well developing the process in Framingham. I was pleasantly surprised with that. I made reference earlier about the 54-46 vote. That's a factor when the no marijuana crowd tries to push to put limitations and restrictions. That created let me call it a legislative mandate for folks who were developing the zoning ordinances, that those who were wavering on the fence had concerns. The fact that the voters voted in that direction was what gave them the impetus to lean towards more liberal stance on how we set up the process.
Yeah, we haven't had any surprises yet, but none of ours are open for business yet. Maybe that's coming.
No major surprises in Holyoke either. I guess I would say I'm more impressed by the sort of the change in perception of the industry over a brief period of time, and that's not specific to Holyoke, but around the state. You know, watching folks that were actively campaigning against legalization in 2016 now see the benefits of the industry and now embracing it, I think has been a success. A surprise to some extent, but not really a surprise, because once people actually sit down and want to be rational human being and have common sense, then they'll understand the benefits of the industry and legalization. And I think all of us up here are rational when it came to the question about the host community agreements, but we also recognize that there are local officials in other communities that aren't being so rational negotiating agreements with cannabis company proponents. So, you know, I do commend Commissioner Title's efforts to have the CCC weigh in on those agreements. I think it's important that the CCC revisit that conversation because, again, I think it's important that we treat all applicants to some level of equity and a certain standard, and make sure we don't put an unnecessary burden on those people that may not have access financially or otherwise to the industry in particular.
Great.
No major surprises. I didn't realize there could be so many different chocolate bar jokes that could be made. Again, the lines, I am surprised by the lines, frankly. I knew that there'd be a lot of people interested, and I thought, you know, in the initial week would be a big push, but really, if you go by our neta today, there's still the same lines. Very respectful, very responsible folks who are all there. A lot of out-of-state plates, I would note. But I think that's been the real big surprise for me, is just how much pent-up interest and excitement there is about what legalization means here in Massachusetts. So I'm, again, particularly proud that Northampton's been a leader and at the forefront of it.
Because local government is so citizen-directed and so many people are involved, this next question follows up on a point that was made just by Mayor Morse. Are you doing anything to actively address the concerns and fears of those who did not vote in favor? And do you see that as a role of local government? So we'll start with Mayor Morse and then go down the line.
Are we actively addressing some of the fears that were raised by opponents of legalization? Is that the question?
Yes, in your community, with people who are concerned and opposed it in your community. How are you addressing those issues and concerns and having a dialogue?
Yeah, I think sort of relates to the previous question about surprises. I've been a little bit surprised. Even our most conservative members of the city council have not blocked special permits for a lot of the folks in this industry from moving forward. Yes, they've placed some conditions on the special permit, and we have a special permit process. But we've convinced even the most conservative members of our council, a couple in particular, that this is a net benefit for the community. And so again, even those folks that were campaigning against it, I think the more you neutralize with information about what legalization means and the benefits that it has for communities, recreational and medicinal, looking at data in other states where you see a decline in opioid abuse and overdose deaths, and the fact is that people have easy access to marijuana, whether it's legal or not. And so just you have a conversation about facts, and eventually I think people, they may not come out and support, but the more you can neutralize them in terms of data and information and facts about the industry and what it means for Holyoke and other communities, then they sort of, you take some wind out of the sails of people that once had a platform against it. In terms of residents, I will say, politically we've been lucky. There hasn't been an outcry of residents that show up at public hearings or local meetings against legalization or against a business in particular. We've seen that happen in other communities. West Springfield, which borders Holyoke, I know the mayor there was working to legalize and pass an ordinance that allowed recreational use, but because a majority of West Springfield residents voted against it in 2016, the council, by majority vote, only one person voted in favor, banned adult use in West Springfield. And so while I don't think that's a good move for their town, I mean, selfishly it means that more businesses will eventually inevitably cluster in Holyoke where they're welcome. And so I think, communities that, again, are being too restrictive need to understand that, the market value will not exist or benefit your community in terms of revenue, the host community agreements, taxes, and jobs. And so you're making a decision, again, that's, I think, at the negatively impacting the community that you represent. And I think that's something that needs to continue to be talked about. I think there's a little bit more opposition to on-site consumption or cannabis cafes, something that I, as mayor, have fully embraced, and we're still waiting for more guidance or legislative intervention to make that happen. I think it's a mistake to look at this in the direction we're getting is that cities have to opt in instead of the traditional route of actually opting out. And so the burden is on us as a community that is embracing on-site consumption, that wants to provide a pathway for entrepreneurs and small business folks in Holyoke with a much smaller barrier to access financially, that segment of the industry. But again, we have no path to do that at this moment. And so we've begun conversations with our legislative delegation. Again, Commissioner Title was in town last week, and we met with our own state representative, Aaron Vega, along with other state rep-elects from across the Pioneer Valley to start, Mayor Narkowitz was part of that conversation, to just start strategizing about how we can go about potentially getting legislative intervention to provide a pathway for on-site consumption, that market in communities like Holyoke, communities that want it and want to embrace it, because currently we'd have to get signatures, a majority of voters to opt into it, which just procedurally just doesn't make any sense to me or any of us in the city.
As far as dealing with the actual fears based on things they are worried about, I think the CCC dealt with that, and I think the regulations took care of that. As far as dealing with the opposition, which is largely fear-based, not being a professional politician, I'm not particularly good at that, other than to have asked people to separate this from morality. It's no longer a morality question, according to the vote.
So there's two levels of fear that I've witnessed. One is, as we're going through the process of zoning and such, the concern of some where Framingham was a yes vote community and most of the communities surrounding Framingham were no's. The fear was that Framingham would be the pot capital of Massachusetts. And I think the reality is, especially as more communities are opening up, that's not the case. That, as an industry, it'll be well dispersed, and it's, whatever negative connotations folks perceive, I think that'll quickly dissipate. The other part, more at the local level, as we went through the whole process, there were people engaged in zoning and all that. The reality is starting to hit closer as we talk about host community agreements to specific, for entities looking at specific sites. So the neighbors in and around those areas are starting to wake up saying, what? And it's going to be right next to me. So they're starting to wake up and engage. What the conversation I've had with a number of entities is that you folks have to step up to the plate, don't blow this for everybody else, meaning that as we get hit with challenges of parking and traffic things, the industry folks, you need to step in and engage and address and reach out and talk to the neighbors. It's up to you folks. We have our role to play as the municipality, but for the industry folks, as the first ones in, you're setting the tone for everyone else so that when neighbors rise up and with concerns, the industry folks, you need to get out there, you need to engage as much as the city does to listen, meet, and mitigate as much as possible.
Well, we tried best to distinguish between the people with emotional opinions and intellectual opinions. Hudson has its share of emotional opinions, and the leaders in town, the Board of Selectmen, know that they're not going to change those opinions. We are the home community of State Trooper Thomas Clardy, who was, killed by somebody who was allegedly under the influence. It's tough to talk about. But those people who are intellectually engaged, we will do our best to get current research, actual research, hard facts to them so they can make the intellectual decisions.
Thank you. I have the plurality right here, 3 related questions. And since we have about 15 minutes left in this, if we can, maybe we'll have Mayor Narkowitz do this, and if people want to add something, then we'll open it to the panel, and then that's the way we'll handle each of these. We'll go down the line. This next question, these 3, I'll just read them, and you'll see how they're related. How important is being local versus being an experienced operator with regard to vetting applicants? What are the top 4 attributes that you look at when deciding who you will give a host agreement to? And what advice would you give to a small local entrepreneur that is competing with big corporations at a community level? Lots of cities are saying they want companies that will grow their own product or put hundreds of thousands into old buildings or something. Essentially, the idea is local, outside the community. Does that matter? What are you looking for in a host community, in applicants? What are the top attributes?
This is going to be brief because, as I said, we don't have a formal local application process. I have not denied anyone a host community agreement. I have only one applicant that we haven't signed with because there's some question about whether their site meets the zoning. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about that.
Okay, then we'll go.
We're not doing a beauty pageant. We're not. We're trusting that the license process that the Cannabis Commission is going to put people through will be very rigorous in terms of background and security. So that's sort of our process.
Okay.
Yeah, similar to Mayor Narkowitz in Northampton, I mean, there's not much risk to the city in executing a host community agreement with any company that wants one. I mean, the onus is on them to go through the regulatory process with the Cannabis Control Commission. So we're very easy and simple in that sense. You want a host community agreement, we'll have a meeting, we'll talk about the property in question, letter of support if needed. But again, we have no formal application process. Again, if you end up going to the state, then we know that you've passed every test that you need to pass to be in our community. In terms of the local versus non-local question, I think it's important, obviously, to support the local folks and make sure that there's avenues and paths for folks to get involved in the industry. I do have to say, in retrospect, I think it was important that, or helpful rather, that a national company with dispensaries and cultivation in other states was the first company to cultivate in Holyoke, because they obviously had the processes, their business plan was down, they had the financing, and so we had a lot of some local folks, some were prepared, some more well-financed than others, and the fact that a very reputable company, GTI based in Illinois, was opening up and had all of the engineers and the architects and their business plan and success to point to in other communities, I think assuaged some of the concerns of some of the members of the city council. And so because of that positive first experience with someone that wasn't based in Holyoke or even Massachusetts, I think it's now helped pave the way with more comfort on the industry as it relates to people in the city that are now looking to do the same.
Yeah, we don't have a local versus not criteria. So far, all 4 of them have had at least a local foot in the door, and from too far away, people don't really know we exist, so it doesn't come up much.
We want to work with businesses that are transparent and economically viable and have the means to address the significant issues that we've all talked about before. There are some folks who I've met with who seems like this would be a pretty interesting, great new idea to get into this business, and I'm not so sure, they have the wherewithal to meet all the requirements. So that's part of our having our, the advisory team is to kind of vet that out. We want folks that are viable, will be responsive, and some preference, not a hard criteria, but folks that we know is helpful, or have operated in Massachusetts is helpful.
Yeah, we don't have a specific vetting process either. We'll take a look at anyone. We look at the total package, the experience of the people, the location, whether they're local or national. It really doesn't make a difference. We look at it the same way we would with Jim's Sandwich Shop and Subway. There's room for both.
And we'll start with you and come down with the simple question. The question is, do you think that formal traffic and parking studies should be mandatory in the local approval process? We'll start with you and go down the line. Tom.
Well, it is part of the process. We actually, unlike some of the other communities here, do have a special permit, so it is part of the process.
So in Framingham, part of picking the zoning and what areas, that's part of it, but site plan review is part of the process. So it's like any other business. We want to take a look-see at that. We want, when we talk about the host community agreement, we ask what they intend to do for parking and traffic management, all those things. It's just part of the process.
Beyond site plan review, it's not a formal part of the process. We have first applicant or first license opening shortly, and I alerted the police chief and said, contact them, make sure you're ready, but beyond that, no.
Like the others, it's part of the process, site plan review. I would also argue that in some cases, the study is in benefit, it actually benefits the company itself, because there's a lot of assumptions that there's going to be a ton of traffic. For example, we have 2 dispensaries proposed in a specific location near a couple of manufacturers in town, and the manufacturers are convinced, after seeing what's happening in Northampton, that this is going to happen in Holyoke, and some of their deliveries are not going to be able to get through. Number one, tell them, well, as more open, then foot traffic will go down naturally. But number two, that here's the traffic study that shows that it really won't be any significant impact on your business. And so I think it's good for the city to have, and I think it's good for the business to have.
We don't require them per se. We do have in our zoning, if you're building a facility over a certain square footage for any business, there's triggers, site plan, and would potentially trigger a traffic review. But again, if you're opening, if you're opening a retail outlet in an existing retail portal, it's not a requirement under our zoning.
There are 2 questions now that are related to the host community agreements, and some sense that asking for voluntary donations or support for other groups could be considered to be unfair. So while the MMA's position is that communities definitely have the authority to negotiate in the public interest, and that'll manifest itself in multiple ways, yeah, I think it would be good to hear from the panel about whether or not they've had any other community engagement provisions in the host community agreements.
I didn't participate in the answer to the question about opposition during the process. The one group that we did hear from throughout both the ballot question process and then throughout the development of all the regulations, the planning and zoning regulations, were the folks who are working on youth substance abuse in our community, primarily with our high school aged population, who are doing a lot of great work around alcohol, tobacco, and increasingly marijuana. That was the big concern we had, that we heard throughout the process. So we do have a provision in our host community agreements where the folks who are applicants in our community will work with nonprofits that are doing youth substance abuse prevention, focused on responsible use of adult use marijuana and trying to ensure that youth do not have access to it. So we do have that provision in terms of a voluntary grant process, that it's not coming to the city, it's coming to a nonprofit. They would have to apply for it. They have to actually initiate it, but we do have that provision in our and I will say, because I pretty much to a person, everyone that has come into my office to talk to me about wanting to operate in Northampton has said, I want to support nonprofits. I want to support charities. We want to be good stewards. We want to be responsible, stewards of this industry. So I view this as formalizing that and really targeting to an area that we've already identified in the community that wants to work with them on an issue, as opposed to just randomly making random donations. This seemed like a good way to marry those concerns, very real concerns during the process, to what I was hearing from pretty much every applicant that came into my office.
We don't have any language in the host community agreement that mandates or requires or spells out a commitment to donations to charities or local organizations. I don't necessarily think it's appropriate. I think it opens up a can of worms, honestly, especially in a city where the city council's involved in the special permit process. I think it feels kind of yucky when you have those conversations with the private sector that you have to give X amount of dollars to X nonprofit. And then you get into whose relationship, what counselor is related to somebody on the board of what nonprofit organization. We also had a situation where one of our counselors was the executive director of a local nonprofit organization and was separately asking companies to donate to a fund that would go towards beautifying the neighborhood or whatnot, which in my opinion was completely inappropriate, given that this person also had a vote on the final special permit. And so I think to protect both the city's interest, protect local organizations, and also protect the integrity of the applicants, because if applicants themselves, if they feel like they need to give this money to be able to get the permit or get their license, will oftentimes do it. And I think that pressure and that sort of arm twisting is inappropriate. And so I disagree that cities have the right to do that.
I do have to clarify, the city council doesn't approve special permits in Northampton or have any role really in the process other than voting for the zoning. So it's a little bit of a different situation.
Right. I guess that's one of the reasons why it's so good to have so many different communities on the panel, because the experience of one community is different from another.
So the two things I saw in host agreements as I was researching that I didn't like were a fee separate from a community impact fee, and some of those were quite large, an annual fee, and then the much smaller $10,000 or $15,000 required contribution to a nonprofit. In talking with some of the applicants and also with the town's attorney, he agreed probably the larger one, probably neither of them are legal or supportable. There's the mitigation fee, which we're allowed to charge. Everything else, it really seemed like extortion because we could give this license. That said, none of the applicants had a problem with we ended up with a $10,000 contribution to a local nonprofit of their choice. We left it in there. They were all going to do that anyway. Probably it's not defensible.
Much like Mayor Morris, I have the same queasy feelings on the whole subject. So speaking for myself, we have no language in our host community agreements referencing that. Saying that, it is my experience that healthy communities Vibrant communities are the ones, be it individuals or businesses, who are successful on their own volition, turn around and reinvest in their community in areas of need. That's how you keep a community very healthy. If you have a disengaged wealth from the need, the community dies. So in a general sense, that should just be the nature of successful businesses, people in a community, to look for, to be engaged, and to contribute to causes of those where there are needs.
We also have a small donation in our community host agreements. We avoid the political problem because the Board of Selectmen approved the community host agreement, but the Zoning Board of Appeals issues the special permit. So there is no tie between the two. We don't have a problem. Our applicants generally have not said anything negative about the donations. And in fact, last night when we approved our first host agreement for a cultivator, the cultivator came before the Board of Selectmen and said, we don't think the donation is big enough. We're going to voluntarily add $5,000 or $10,000 to the donations. So I think there are plenty of applicants out there who don't have a problem with it.
All right, there's, so we've reached 2:35. We need to be fair to the next panel. There are a couple of questions that are not, that have not been asked because, and they're all unfortunately written, so we have to follow the process for questions as announced. But they are both questions regarding social equity programs, encouraging minority groups or organizations to be involved, and particular segments, and those are specific topics for the next panel. So unfortunately, we could do this all day, but these folks have pretty much, because of driving into Boston and then driving back, have given their day to you in a discussion of this. So let's give our panel a round of applause.
Director of the Cannabis Control Commission, and very pleased to be here with all of you and also with this esteemed panel to discuss a number of topics, but specific issues relative to economic development, social equity, public health, and other considerations. So it's a very broad bucket, but I think we've got the right panel here to really get into a lot of this. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as we kind of get started this afternoon, but again, just want to express my gratitude to the folks that have been very instrumental in pulling this together and supporting this, and also many of the communities that are here with us today and represented. Also mindful of the fact that we have some operators here today, which I think hopefully they'll be willing and excited to share their perspective on what that local interaction has been. So again, I'll let them each kind of introduce themselves down the line here, if you wouldn't mind, and I guess we'll start with, let's see, why don't we go from my left to the further left, which is Marcos, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Just introductions? Just introductions?
That's it,
Okay. Yep. I'm Marcos Marrero, Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of Holyoke, so I'll try to keep the pitch to the minimum, seeing as my boss already gave it.
Jeff Kravitz, Economic Development Director for the Town of Amherst.
Michael Dundas, CEO of Sierra Naturals. We're a medical marijuana operator with a cultivation manufacturing facility in the town of Milford and 3 dispensaries in the communities of Cambridge, Somerville, and the town of Needham.
I'm Ray Miyares from the law firm of Miyares and Harrington. We're a town council shop. We are serve as town council for 8 cities and towns in Massachusetts, 4 of whom are yes communities and 4 of whom are no communities.
George Proakis. I manage the Planning and Development Office in the city of Somerville, where we at this point have 3 operating medical dispensaries, and just this past week put zoning and licensing rules in place for adult use marijuana.
Good afternoon. My name's Sia Samora, and I'm an economic empowerment applicant here for licensing in the state of Massachusetts. I've been a cannabis consumer rights advocate here for several years, and I've managed a private cannabis club, so I'm just happy to be here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Eric Slagle. I'm the Director of Development Services for the City of Lowell. We have one operating medical dispensary and host community agreements for two medical cultivation facilities and a second medical dispensary, and we adopted comprehensive marijuana zoning back in May.
Hi, my name is Sam Wong. I'm the Public Health Director for the City of Framingham. I don't have a name tag. Who am I? Which is not unusual for us in working for public health. We're always trying to get a seat at the table. Finally, I got one at the last one on the table.
So again, thank you to our panel. I think it's we have a big panel here, and I think I'll do my best to make sure everybody gets incorporated. But mindful of the fact that we do have a big panel, I think we should just jump right into it. And I guess Marcos, we'll start with you, and we'll kind of make our way down. We're lucky that we have a lot of different municipal officials here, but some that are specifically involved in economic and community development decisions in their respective communities. And we're very excited to have you represented here. But I guess I'll pose this question to each of you, and it's a broad one. Why cannabis? And also, was it more or less difficult to plan for than other types of businesses? And if so, or if not, why?
Why cannabis, and was it harder or not? For Holyoke, it was very aligned with our competitive advantages. The mayor said earlier that we have one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, electrical rate in the city. Holyoke has been a community that fits within the definition of historically disadvantaged on the war on drugs. We have a significant amount of property that is vacant, an old mill space. And we're in a location that does a lot of manufacturing in Western Massachusetts. So it was a natural fit for us in terms of economic development. Has it been easier for us to do that than other things? Oddly enough, I'll say from my perspective, yes, because so many other cities have put moratorias. Keep putting them on. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. I can't say that at the CCC shindig. But it certainly helped us in the sense that if you're competing for business, and the right way of doing this, of doing local economic development isn't poaching businesses. But particularly as the industry gets started and people are trying to see, okay, where's the best fit? Where can I locate? Where will I put my massive amount of investment dollars? To be able to say, hey, we have political stability. We have the first mayor that came out in support of this. You will save probably 40% on operational costs of electricity. We have the space here. And if you want to be in Western Mass, look at all the red dots, right? Like, come on in. So from that perspective, it's been much easier. It's not always. That's not to say that it's always been easy. As I sit here and I see these are the same microphones that they use at our city council, I get a little bit of PTSD. But we get through it. And addressing all the issues that the first panel talked about.
Yeah. Jeff, how about Amherst?
So Amherst voted 74% in favor of the ballot question. I've heard the previous panel talk about what percentage, and I think that's the highest, probably top 5 in the state. So from our perspective, we had a mandate from our voters that this is something that they wanted in Amherst. I think that we also had a recognition that people were consuming cannabis in Amherst anyway. And so not recognizing that and not trying to take advantage of the fact that it is now legal in the state, there's a regulatory process, there are certain benefits to allowing consumption legally, including the testing and knowing what's in the product. The local option tax that we passed in Amherst. I think those are some of the reasons that we were forward-thinking in cannabis, and the recognition that because it was already happening, it would continue to happen, and if we didn't allow retail shops and cultivation and other types of marijuana establishment businesses in Amherst. It would happen elsewhere, and we would still be dealing with the same issues without any of the income, either through the host community agreements or through the tax on products. As for whether it's harder than other businesses, I've never gone through having to, the birthing of a new industry. So I think that that in conjunction with the fact that there has been for a long time a negative preconceived notion about the product, and it's been illegal for a number of years. It's still federally illegal. I think those types of things have been difficult. Like other towns, Amherst just moved to a city form of government, but previously we had town meeting, and so the timing of our town meetings with when regulations were coming out and the law was coming out and we expected licenses to be issued, I think that was another difficulty, trying to get zoning passed and being prepared for it. But it's, even though there are some shops open, I think it's still early, so we're figuring it out and moving forward as best we can.
Sure, thank you. George, how about Somerville?
Well, beginning with some similarities to Amherst, when medical marijuana was on the ballot in Somerville in 2012, 77% of the people who voted on it in our community voted in favor. When the adult use cannabis regulation was on the ballot in 2016, 75% voted in favor of it. I sometimes point out to people that on those 2 years we had the Community Preservation Act in our new high school on the ballot, and marijuana got more yes votes than both of those items did both times. So I think the community mandate's been there all along, that it's time to allow this as a legal option and regulate it. And I think from the perspective of establishing adult use marijuana, the community and our Board of Aldermen and our mayor have taken very seriously the strategy that regulating it like one regulates alcohol, as the original ballot question said, was something that they looked at very seriously. Now, with that said, the issue about it being any more easier or more difficult than other businesses, I think when you start establishing a new industry, it allows an opportunity to make sure that that industry works in your community in a way that matches your community's values. And Somerville is a place that, for starters, requires special permits and substantial amount of process for a lot of things. We try to do our best to try to work with folks we want to get in and want to make things work in the community with and make sure it works well. When we did medical, we had 15 or 16 entities who came in and met with the mayor and said they wanted to be there. We knew we weren't going to open 15 medical marijuana dispensaries, so we established a process by which to determine who was going to get a letter of non-opposition. Now, with bringing adult use marijuana in, I think the thing that is more challenging for us is making sure to do it in a way that's consistent with our community values, and therefore the thing that has taken us 6 or 7 months of process to complete is establishing a zoning and licensing process that works for us and works fairly, and most significantly, as this panel is about, that it addresses the issue of social equity, as well as the issue of providing an opportunity for some of our local community members to participate in this business. So that's been our focus.
Nice.
And Eric, how are things in Lowell as far as your experience?
Sure. So Lowell, a little bit differently than Somerville and Amherst, had a much closer vote on the adult use ballot question. I think it was 56 to 44. It meant that while we had a mandate to proceed with setting up a regulatory scheme, there was some significant opposition that we had to deal with. When we dealt with medical marijuana in the beginning, we didn't even zone for it. We just treated it like any other medical use. We allowed it where other medical uses were allowed. It was required to get a special permit like the other medical uses were. But we started in December, right after the ballot question was passed, to draft comprehensive zoning regulations for adult use marijuana. And we had to fight some of the fights with the folks who wanted to put in a moratorium and eventually go through the process to ban it. So there was a significant conversation that we had both in the legislative body of the city council and with the public about doing some education towards what would be the end result of both of those choices. I think that the city made the right choice. We chose to regulate it and allow it, but it was definitely much more challenging than a lot of the other zoning and regulatory processes that we regularly go through because, like it or not, of the stigma around marijuana. So we had to do an educational process with the city council and outreach to the neighborhood groups to let them know why we thought, as the city administration, it was the appropriate path to take to regulate it rather than ban it. And the reasons that we gave were the economic development reasons, because as I think has been mentioned both in the other panel and earlier today, the amount of cannabis use in Lowell was not going to change whether we banned it or allowed it. The amount of cannabis being consumed was going to be the same, and so we chose to embrace the economic development value of cultivation, especially, which is something that we've been pushing, but also of the retail and kind of come at it from that direction.
George, if I can come back to you for a second too. You touched on something that I think a lot of folks in the room are certainly curious about as far as how Somerville went about it, which is you've developed a model, I think, for integrating social equity into your local cannabis industry. I think, again, a lot of folks are watching that and are probably discussing this in their communities as well. Can you tell us a little bit about it, but also how it works and what were your considerations when developing it?
Sure, and I found it a little amusing that one of the headline writers in the Boston Globe, in talking about Boston's licensing, referred to it as a Somerville-style equity initiative. So we'll happily label it that for now, if people want to call it that. But we spent a lot of time looking at the strategy surrounding local licenses. So quick background: we have three operating medical facilities. I spent a substantial amount of time with the community talking about where and how they should work as medical facilities. We made an early determination that we wanted our medical facilities located in our business districts, not in the far corner of the city, and we created an overlay map for medical that really focused on those areas. And we have one, for those who know Somerville, one in Davis Square, one in Union Square, one on Broadway in East Somerville. They're very much in the center of the community. When we went to adult use and the rules were created at the state level that essentially allowed them to convert, we had provisions in our host agreements that basically said that notwithstanding that, they would agree to go through whatever process we established on licensing. And there was a lot of conversation about that. What we decided to suggest was to begin with a discussion about the idea that we would establish a local license process. Similar to the way we did medical, probably prior to coming to the License Commission, we would set up a staff-level committee, meet with anybody who wanted to be licensed and make recommendations to the License Commission in terms of kind of priority scoring in terms of who we thought should probably be earliest in sort of working our way through the license process. And we added as a provision that we thought it would make sense to allow the medical facilities and the economic empowerment applicants and any entity that was more than 50% owned by local Somerville residents to have an opportunity to go first. A lot of the feedback we got was that the medical facilities are certainly ready to go, and we know that. And there was some discussion and debate about, well, how much is an economic empowerment applicant ready to go? How much is a local business ready to go? They don't necessarily have cultivation facilities set up. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? There was some discussion about chopping the medicals out of the early applicant process. And after a substantial amount of conversation, we came to a process whereby for a period of time, what we will do is we will only accept applicants from that pool, but the instructions and the way the licensing is set up for the License Commission is that they are to issue them in an order in that at no point in time can anybody who isn't in a priority pool have more licenses than ones that are in a priority pool, which basically means that a priority pool licensee has to get licensed first. And the priority pool that's that list is basically the economic empowerments, the ones who are running cooperatives, and and the ones that are more than 50% owned by Somerville residents. So essentially, the first license has to go to one of those entities. Beyond that, a second license can go to a medical operation, but a second medical can't get a license to switch until yet another one in that first category gets a license. So it's a one-to-one jump, the way it's basically set up, to ensure that as our 3 medicals potentially go to doing medical and recreational, that we will also make sure that we're bringing local and social equity applicants into the pool at that time. Our hope is that there are applicants in that pool that are interested in applying. If there aren't applicants in that pool that are interested in applying, we may have just created an incentive for our medical entities to try to work with applicants in that pool that are interested in applying, and try to make sure there are applicants in that pool that are interested in applying should they want to make the switch to adult use sooner rather than later. So that's the basics of the Somerville strategy. As I said, the goal is to be consistent with where our community's values and interests are. There's a substantial amount of money in this industry, both locally and nationally. We are a community that has been discussing seriously as part of our zoning overhaul work, strategies for dealing with formula businesses, strategies for dealing with trying to make sure that the small local flavor of our business communities continue to work the way they have been. I think our 3 medical dispensaries have become great local partners, but beyond that, we want to make sure that we have more, and that those are ones that are in a position where they'll be able to add some benefit within where our community is focused. Beyond that, after that initial period expires, even though ones beyond the medical dispensaries can get licenses, the rule continues that more than half of the applicants with holding existing licenses have to be in that priority pool. So we hope to continue to make sure that that establishes a system where entities going forward in Somerville have a substantial opportunity, that we make sure the social equity piece of it is an important part of the picture.
So as a quick follow-up to that, it sounds like it's a well-thought-out plan, and I think obviously well-intentioned as well. How will the city be measuring your success in doing that? What types of assessments might you be doing, or frankly, what does success look like?
It's an interesting question. I think success for us is a thriving industry where a substantial portion of it is having benefits to social equity and local applicants. While still we are welcoming to all in that process, and it will evolve and go as it starts up over time. I think the intent of that is that we are able to know that there's an opportunity for a social equity applicant not just to get a state or local license, but also to get through the process of opening on a site and being a successful business. One of the things we are going to do to try to make sure that's possible is for the early applicant pool, we're going to do the same thing we did with medical, where we will welcome all of them to submit applications in a forthcoming deadline. We'll look at all of them and make recommendations to the Licensing Commission to find entities that meet our goals while also looking like they will be successful businesses in locations that can get through our process and get open in an efficient period of time.
And I guess I'll use this as an opportunity to make another plug that on your seats when you came in today was the Commission's guidance on local equity as well. So I think between that document and that guidance, which is on our website, as well as the experience in Somerville, hopefully there's some tools there for folks to begin to explore this. Sam, so you mentioned that you wanted the seat at the table, so now you're in the hot seat. Are there specific things that a health department, so as the health director for the city of Framingham, are there specific things that you've done to prepare, and what has your local community response been like?
Our process in Framingham started almost a year ago, when late December, when the CNB, the Cannabis Control Commission, released the draft regulation at that time. We were very concerned looking at the draft regulation. There's a number of gaping holes in our opinion. So we means a number of large city health directors. We grouped together and also recruited the Massachusetts Association of Health Board to form a ad hoc working group to try to draft a model regulation for local boards of health to adopt. to supplement the state regulation. And we were very, very pleased that the revised final regulation from the CNB was fixed a lot of the gaping holes that we found. So our draft regulation was from this thick to just 4 or 5 pages. And in Framingham, we submitted our draft regulation to our Board of Health. We held 2 public hearings in addition to 4 public meetings accepting public comments on those draft Board of Health regulations. And we finally passed a version of the local health regulation for adult use marijuana back in August of this year. In our local regulation, we believe that it's a very sensible approach. Personally, I don't believe banning it will solve the cannabis issue. So I don't believe that community banning the whole industry is going to solve adolescents' marijuana use. They're still going to use it. Our regulation includes a local licensing structure. In Framingham, that means after the initial community host agreement and approval for an establishment to open, after that, it becomes the health department's responsibility to continue to license them on an annual basis. That's the bulk of our local regulations, creating a local licensing structure. We also adopted state food code into our local health regulation because the State Department of Public Health does not believe that cannabis-infused edibles are considered food. So we believe that we still have to maintain the food safety and sanitation aspect of any food product that includes cannabis. So we adopted the state food code as part of our local requirement. It's been in effect since August, and now, as my boss Thatcher earlier mentioned, that we are going through the citywide review process for the adult use retailers.
Thank you. So I'll put this to the panel, but I guess Ray, if you don't mind, I guess we'll start with you. And pivoting a bit, how have you approached host community agreements? And as an attorney representing municipalities, is there a standard approach, or is it more of a case-by-case basis? And frankly, where do you begin?
Okay, well, host community agreements have in fact been around for a long time in a lot of different settings with a lot of different kinds of facilities. What's new about host community agreements for cannabis facilities is that this is the first time that I know about where there are going to be a lot of licenses issued at the state, and a host community agreement is required for each one. The idea of requiring a host community agreement as part of a permitting process first appeared for casinos, but there are only a couple of those, and so this is really something new where there's going to be a lot of licenses issued and therefore a whole lot of host community agreements. So typically the municipalities that we represent have used host community agreements when they're dealing with the unicorn, the power plant or the waste facility, something that's unique and has a lot of unique characteristics, a lot of unique impact. So we have developed a way of thinking about host community agreements that is that thinks in terms of making sure that the exact components of the facility that's being proposed are locked down so that they don't change over time, that the impacts of the facility are identified, and the ways of mitigating those are set forth. Most of these facilities that we've always dealt with have been regarded by the communities as having, even with mitigation, an overall negative impact on the community, and so we always include provisions to offset that, to make the deal more attractive to the town, and The fourth component is to include some stress testing of the agreement. In other words, what happens if this goes wrong? What happens if this goes right? So what happens if the facility ends up not being economically viable or shuts down too soon, or it ends up being bigger and it needs to expand? Well, how are we going to deal with those things? I think that outline still works for marijuana facilities. Our experience has been that these agreements are really all quite different, and so I was interested to see that that in some of these larger communities, the host community agreements have been standardized already. Most of the communities that we deal with are working with one or two or a small number of applicants and are moving slowly. For many of them, it's the first time they've ever had to do a host community agreement. So the idea that they get to tailor it for their individual circumstances is very appealing.
Sure, yeah.
Somerville's 3 medical agreements are the same, and I expect we will get to the point where our adult use are the same as well. And there's a lot of different thoughts on this. When we were going through the process in medical, one of our dispensaries went to a neighborhood meeting and started promising various money to local nonprofits in that district, and came back and wanted me to put it in the agreement. And I was like, I'm not going to put that in the agreement. You can donate money to whomever you would like to donate money to, but what I don't want is I don't want to start a competition about who's going to give the most. I'm not selling licenses, and I think that that was very important. So while there may be circumstances where there are certain specific, site-specific activities that at the end of the day may someday cause us to say, okay, there's a reason why this agreement has to address this issue or this agreement has to address that issue, I think that to the extent that we are trying to address the opportunity for social equity businesses to be a part of the mix, one of the things we absolutely have to push back on is the idea that we are selling licenses to the highest bidder of sorts, to the entity that can put together the highest, best host community agreement and offer the most to the community, which is why everything we did on the medical side and everything we are going to do on the adult use side is going to start from the underlying perspective that we want to, A, find the best partner that matches our values, and B, sign a fair agreement with that partner at getting them through licensing and zoning, whatever steps may be done. So to the extent that there are differences between agreements, I'm very reluctant to go beyond saying, I want to make sure the core of that agreement is based upon the idea that, yes, we want that 3% towards impacts. We see there will be impacts. We see there will be issues on the medical side. We put every penny of that money towards substance abuse prevention programs, and we may very well do that in the adult use as well. But the key issue is I want to make it very clear that we're sticking with the expectation. It will be the same. It will be fair. It will not be set up in a circumstance where if 2 entities are in front of the License Commission at a similar time, one of them can be able to try to bargain additional deals into a host community agreement, because it's going to start to separate away from the idea that we're picking social equity applicants because we want social equity applicants in the mix. As I said before, there may be a lot of deeper pockets entities in this business, and I don't necessarily want to create a circumstance where it makes it tougher for the social equity applicants.
Sure, Eric.
So we started the process having a few host community agreements for medical, both for the cultivation, manufacturing, and for medical dispensaries floating out there that had already been signed. And we kind of scrapped all those and started from the beginning and came up with a template before we met with any individual applicant. So we created a host community agreement template that incorporated what we thought were the things that we wanted. It had the 3% in there, but most importantly, it had things like use local vendors, to the extent it's legal, use local hiring. We came up with a list of community impacts that we wanted to basically put into the agreement. You will agree that if we spend money on these things, those are potential community impacts. And I give that host community, that drafted that host community agreement to anybody who calls and says, I'm interested in doing cannabis business in Lowell. So our goal from the beginning has been standard agreement, standard template. We don't, as anybody in this room knows, anytime an attorney touches an agreement, they want to change it. But we do our best to say, yeah, this is what we're looking for. We don't want you to propose significant changes to this, because everybody is going to be on the same playing field, and that's kind of been our approach to it. We have it. We're not waiting for you to provide one to us. We have our goals and our agreements.
Jeff?
Yeah, we had a similar process for medical and recreational. We had a template. We sent it out, solicited comments from anybody who wanted to tell us what they thought about it, things that they didn't like about it. In our rec process, we actually had one applicant say, yep, this is good on our first draft. And we came back to them and we said, well, here's what we're negotiating with others. We think it's to all businesses' benefit. Would you be willing to sign this one that we think is better for you? And they said, yeah, sure, we'll sign that one too. But, you know, I think and we recommended the town manager signed host community agreements with 3 applicants, and 2 of them were willing to sign that template, and with some adjustments that we negotiated, and the 3rd one said we want further negotiation, so we're negotiating with them. So I think that at least our approach is we want to start with a template that lays out the basic foundation, but if there is room for negotiation, because I think that was fairly clear from the legislation that it was supposed to be a back and forth between the municipality, the host community, and the potential operators. And to a previous point about tracking social equity and stuff, one of the things we included in our host community agreement is actually requiring, if asked by the municipality, how many local people have you hired in the last year? How many, you know, within the confines of the law, what is your employee base looking like? Where do they come from? What are their ages? We just want to know, because you represented certain things to us when you wanted to open a business here. So, you know, unlike Somerville, I don't think we had, or actually I'm not sure if Somerville has this, but I don't think that we felt that we had enough economic empowerment applicants or social equity applicants to actually do a one-to-one. If we had, maybe we would have tried to copy that approach, but we wanted to at least track how the businesses in our community were doing, because we felt it was important to address those somehow.
Marcos, I think the mayor mentioned previously that there are about 21 or so in Holyoke. How have you found that experience as far as negotiating with each of them?
So the mayor alluded to this. We basically have a roll of paper. We go like that, and I say, just here, sign it. So it's a basic contract, very similar approach that my colleagues have talked about here. So it's been, the biggest amount of work was up front, trying to really put pen to paper on conditions that we felt were going to be uniform throughout the industry, and then leaving site-specific issues to the site plan review process and the special permit process, whether it's a traffic issue or signage issue, whatever it is, that can be dealt with in the special permit. But we did want to create this transparent and uniform process because, number one, we thought it was going to lead to us be more competitive in the market for these businesses. Everyone would understand that we're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. But also, very selfishly, we don't have time to negotiate these things either, right? Like, I know time is of the essence for the industry, but you think I want to negotiate contracts all day? No, that's not the coolest part of my job. So it's like, oh, you want to be in Holyoke? Where's your property zone? Do you have site control? Okay, great. Yep, that's the industrial area. Sign here. Can we no, sign here and it's done, and you can do it in an hour. You can tell your boss you got a great negotiation out of it. And no one's really pushed back. We did, similar to Amherst, we circulated around when we had people early on coming around, and yeah, we were open to negotiation. Of course, if something were to come up, we can always change it. Contracts are to be changed, right? Lawyer touches it, you got to change the contract, but. Yeah, it was pretty good. I will say on the, because we're talking about social equity often, and so we got to be mindful of, so much of what we're talking about here naturally is about regulation, because we're at the Cannabis Control Commission, which issues regulation for the industry, but we're not going to get to social equity through regulation. We're not going to get through, solely. There's certainly barriers that we can put up, and it's very important, for example, the guidance documents we all have. But we're not going to get to social equity without capital equity. It's hard enough in every other industry that's not prohibited federally, right? That you have, or you're supposed to have, access to normal banking channels. And so, at the local level and at the state level, at some point, we're going to have to think about how we're putting real money towards social equity, whether it's through the state fund or other creative mechanisms on the local level, right? So, we haven't outright put it into our host community agreement or the regulatory process, and it's not a criticism at all of the great work that our colleagues have done, but we're looking at other things of what we can do, right? Like many communities have an industrial and economic development corporation. We have one. We're looking at, okay, is there a role for that? Is it legal for us to do it? Will people be freaked out? Probably. Can we do it anyway? So it's just something to have in mind.
Sure, thank you. That's actually a really good segue. And let me also remind folks that you had the cards at your seats as well, so we're happy to take some audience questions, and folks will come around in a few minutes to collect those as well. So if you have an idea, please jot it down, and we're happy to try to address it. But I want to try to get Mike and Sia in here as well, because I think a lot of the conversation we're having is about that local experience from a local government standpoint. But as establishment owners yourselves, how have you found this experience to be? Is this conversation that you're hearing today, does that ring true with the many conversations you've inevitably had with other communities? And what would be your advice to municipalities that are looking to enter this space but are going through that process themselves from a zoning and I guess, see if we want to start with you. And
Oh, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Mike. Why don't you take that first? Go ahead.
Let me first pause and just thank the organizers of this symposium. I think this is an extraordinarily helpful meeting. I've learned a lot here myself. Commissioner McBride, thank you for organizing, for those who assisted in the organization. I think the best way for me to answer that is to talk a little bit about where I think some of the shortfalls are in the tools that municipalities have in order to help and engender the economic empowerment movement, as Mr. Marrero just alluded to a moment ago. And then talk a little bit about how we see the cannabis industry as having a role in this as well, the established cannabis industry. So the way I see the world in this regard is something like this. Cannabis and regulated cannabis is an industry in transformation from an unregulated, underground, illicit activity into a regulated marketplace. The economic empowerment is a social justice movement within the cannabis community that seeks to harness the emergence of the regulated cannabis industry to redress some of the disproportionate impacts that were created by cannabis prohibition to begin with. And we've seen both the legislature and the commission, as it implements the legislative mandates, as well as certain cities and towns, try to grapple with how do we use the tools that we were given in the legislation and the regulations and our authority to promulgate local municipal licensing processes to help foster economic empowerment support. And I think that those tools have largely have come in the form of temporal advantages in the licensing process, so giving folks in the economic empowerment community a priority in licensing, cutting of fees for licensure, and then we're seeing the emergence now of the social equity program, which we could sort of perhaps loosely describe as job training, industry training, that type of thing for folks that qualify. I think that these are all very important, perhaps necessary steps, but from our perspective, as an organization that has grown from an organization of one to now a large cannabis producer in the Commonwealth, it seems to me that that's not nearly enough. The tools are not enough. They're not powerful enough. And so what we've sought to do at our organization, CIRA, is to try to figure out, are there ways that we can find synergies between what we're trying to do anyway at our organization and working with economic empowerment, social equity, area of disproportionate impact businesses to try to get win-win situations. And we've come up with this model, and the model, we're constantly sort of pivoting and innovating on the model. It started off as something that was really focused solely on small businesses in the marijuana-infused products sector. But what we did was we looked around, what are some of our problems? The cannabis companies are never short of problems. We have problems all day long, facility design problems, operational problems, local political problems. And so we identified a couple of problems. One of the problems that we had was, look, we want to have a good product mix on our shelves when we open for adult use. We've seen in other recreational cannabis states, broad product mix. You see it in the supermarket every day, tens of thousands of products. It's difficult for vertically integrated producers to innovate quickly on marijuana-infused products. Might not be a problem that you would think of. So we thought, look, if we have this problem, and we've got these economic empowerment applicants, we've got mandates from the legislature and from the Cannabis Control Commission that says we want to move these people into the process. Why don't we try to marry our needs and their goals? So we created this program called the CIRA Accelerator. We looked to folks that had developed marijuana-infused product prototypes. Most of the folks that we talked to were folks that had operated in the illicit marketplace. And let's also just pause for one moment to remember that when we talk about the illicit marketplace, illegal cannabis, the gray market, oftentimes we talk about it as a monolithic sort of criminal enterprise. And we got to remember that this is an economy that has grown and developed for decades in the United States. And to be sure, there were probably bad actors that participated in that space. But there was also an enormous number of small entrepreneurs that saw cannabis conduct as a way to sort of put money in their pocket in a way that we wouldn't in any other way think was untoward or sort of bad behavior. And as the laws have changed, it was our view that we should try to leverage this experience. I mean, these folks have real solid experience in developing products. We brought these folks in, had a very comprehensive application process. We chose three of the applicants to now be participants in the program. We're helping them to develop their products in our commercial kitchen and our infrastructure. So they've got these infused products. We bring them into our commercial kitchens and help them do what's difficult for small business or small product innovators if they don't have the infrastructure, which is to homogenize and scale, be able to scale those products. And then we hope to put those products on the shelf of our dispensaries and actually build those brands. The brands are owned 100% by the accelerator participants. CIRA Naturals takes a small equity stake in each of these companies, which aligns our incentives. We want them to be successful because their success is our success. And I think we would encourage municipalities, to the extent possible, to think outside of the box in encouraging this type of market-based partnership between larger and smaller organizations.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. That's great. And so I am an economic empowerment applicant. I'm in the CIRA's inaugural class for this business accelerator. Just a little bit more about me. My name's Sia Samora, but many people know me as Chief, a local cannabis consumer rights activist. I'm also a veteran of the Iraq War. I came back in 2004 to experience medicinal cannabis. I got a lot of benefit from that, and then I moved into the space trying to create safe access for other people. And so when we're talking about small business and economic empowerment and social equity, right, keep hearing it over and over, but the one thing that's missing, right, is the technical assistance. Right, and so we have all these municipalities saying we want to include social equity applicants and make this market equitable, but there's really no technical assistance for these type of applicants like myself. So that's why these programs and the partnership that we have with CIRA Accelerator is so valuable for us, because we're working now with people who are actually in the market participants. They can show us the ropes probably better than anyone else can and make us efficient and good. And so when starting my business in Boston, and Boston's a little behind in the process, going to the small business department, they were saying their funds all come from federal government, which is understandable. But at the same time, they would throw their hands up and say, well, we don't have any technical assistance for you because all of our money is federal money. Fine, so Boston doesn't have any real technical assistance for economic empowerments. What about the state? So Cannabis Control Commission has a social equity program. But I don't know if folks know there's actually an income requirement. There's an income requirement for that social equity program, and my wife and I, despite the fact we don't make much money, we believe we would be priced out of that program. And I got it here. It says one household family size of 1 is 48,000, 2, 65,000, 3, 83,000. So those are the income requirements for the social equity program, which we don't think we would have been able to participate anyway. And so we're very excited that companies like CIRA understand early that this is a way that they can start working with people, and that this is what we need, is that assistance.
Thank you. And also, thank you for your service as well. Marcos, yes, sure.
Well, we tend to talk about social equity from the supply side, right, which is hugely important, of course. And again, we're talking about the regulator of the industry. But we should also have in mind, I think, that we can't fully have social justice without social consumption on site, because so many people who are lower income live in subsidized housing, which has at least $1, any subsidized housing has at least $1 federal money. And so, you know, it becomes an activity of people who can partake that are only well off, right? If we're not creating spaces for people to equitably participate, not just on the supply side, but on the demand side. And it's probably easier, despite all the, you know, despite all the political pushback, it's probably in practice easier to do on the demand side than on the supply side, because on the supply side, as I said prior, you have to come up with money. And I don't, you know, I don't think the expectations that the Cannabis Control Commission is going to do it by themselves is reasonable. And you know, initiatives like what Sierra Naturals has done has been really impressive.
So I guess, Mike, if you don't mind following up as far as your findings to date, it sounds like it's off the ground and functioning, but what does the future of that program look like for you? And also, I guess you mentioned obviously that the early operators, you're looking to partner with them as well, and so not just invest in them, but also partner with them. Again, I guess the question is, what does the future look like for that program?
Well, one of the things that has been an eye-opener for me is the range of services that we've been able to provide. So we originally started off, as I said, look, we just have, we want to narrow it to infused products manufacturing. We've got this commercial kitchen, we've got infused products expertise. We know folks are out there that have recipes, let's bring them in and just do this infused products thing. As we brought folks in, like Sia at 612 and Hot House Holyoke, another participant from the city of Holyoke, we learned that the needs were much more broad than simply product development. You know, we were a little bit naive in that respect. And so, you know, we're there. We have these meetings. Well, let me also say we envisioned it to be a very rigid program at first. So it was going to last for 3 months. We're going to bring folks in for a certain number of hours per month to go to the kitchen, have a very structured program. It turns out that every one of these companies, not surprisingly, is very unique. They've got different needs, different hopes, different dreams, different types of products. So one of the ways that we pivoted the program was basically to make it a rolling basis. So there is no time limit. Folks can come and go to our facility as they please. We register them as our own dispensary agents. So we leverage the rules of the medical regulations in that way. And we give advice, and really, it's more than just advice. We talk back and forth. We talk through issues. In some sense, we learn as much from them as they learn from us about the marketplace that we're trying to provide to. That's been a real exciting piece of the puzzle for me. And politics, local interactions with local government has been a big piece of that puzzle. In fact, one of our accelerator participants coined a phrase that I'll never forget. We sat down at the conference table, and she said, "You know what? Cannabis is a gateway drug. It's a gateway to politics," and I think that was very true. And so, you know, I think the future for the Sierra Accelerator, I really think the sky is the limit. We have limited bandwidth, which is the one constraint, and that's, I think I was talking to C about this earlier, that our key constraint here is size. So we've only got a few applicants we're going to take on a rolling basis, one at a time as these folks graduate. But we would certainly like to expand the scope of the program within reason.
Sure, thank you. So I guess I'll put this to the panel as well. I just want to be mindful we have about 15 minutes left or so, so I want to make sure we have a chance to hear from everybody. But and this is a very broad question, so I guess interpret it however you may want. But as folks that have kind of lived in this orbit for a while now, knowing that there's hopefully a good portion of this audience that is about to either enter this or has certainly a lot of questions. What advice? What would you offer them for advice, and how would you, I guess the question I often ask my counterparts across the country is, what keeps you up at night, and what do you wish you knew before you get into this? So again, I guess to the entire panel, or I guess if Marcos, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wouldn't mind
Well, you
picking
just said
that
my
up.
name.
You're up.
I guess I don't know that this is advice, but I think it's something that we can all take home, which is comforting. I think, which is the culture around cannabis is changing very rapidly, and so if you can think of all the problems that we've talked about today in terms of regulation and figuring stuff out, there will always be problems, but this is probably as restrictive as it's going to get. Because you heard from the other panel where in Northampton talked about their zoning and how liberal they were able to do it. It was very similar to what the Morse administration was trying to do, where if you can fit a pharmacy, you can fit a cannabis dispensary. We weren't completely successful the first time around, but in every other city, like just like prohibition, like the walls are going to fall. So I think that's one comforting thought. The other is, and this is more directly related to economic development, and one of the things that I have in mind as a local economic development planner is geographic equity, right? So one of the, and maybe, us being in Boston, a lot of folks in the Boston metro area aren't or don't have this in their mind constantly, but in Western Mass we do, which is that if you're not in the Boston metro area, you just don't have as much access to the monetary magic that flows from pharma and tech and the bustling scene. And the missing link in Massachusetts economics seems to be, okay, how do you connect the Boston metro area to some of the lowest income gateway cities throughout the state that are in farther away corners? So when you look at the cannabis industry and you look at companies that are doing processing which is cannabis infused food or medicine or any bunch of other products, it's anything that if it was legally federally would be under the oversight of the Food and Drug Administration. And so what do those processes have really different from any other pharma or food creation? Not really that much. So you can create a workforce now in parts of Massachusetts that don't exist that will allow a bridge to the highest income economy that the state has. And to me, that's part of the most exciting stuff, which is why we created the standard HCA template, so we can dedicate time to that.
Jeff, anything to add to
that? Yeah, I think the first piece of advice would be to make sure you know your community and you understand who makes that up. For Amherst specifically, our median age is just over 21 years old. I think the state's median age is about double that, 42. So half of the Amherst population cannot legally consume marijuana unless they have a medical card and they're over 18. But so understanding the challenges that your community is likely to face based on your demographics and other things, I think is critically important to move forward successfully. In addition, we have 40,000 people about in Amherst. Every year we have 5,000 new people in Amherst between UMass Amherst College and Hampshire College. I'd say the vast majority, if not all of them, are about 18 years old. So, constantly we're going to need to be educating these people, both from in-state and from out of state. Here's the law, here's what's legal, here's what you can do and can't do. And so understanding how your community is, and I'm sure that you all probably have a good idea, but making sure that as a baseline is one thing. And then on a more positive note, what keeps me up at night is, and this is a positive, I promise, is the promise of research. I think one thing that, and I won't speak for everybody, but I think that I've heard again and again is we don't know enough about cannabis. We need to know what the impacts are. We need to know how it affects individuals, how it affects, we know it affects the adolescent brain or the developing brain. We need to know more information. And from a supply side, you know, how different strains affect different people in different ways, not only from a medical perspective, but from an adult use recreational perspective. And the reason it keeps me up at night is because we have a world-class research university in our backyard, which is the largest employer in the region. They get federal funds. They can't do any of this research. I would love for our region, Western Mass, to do some of this, and I know that this area also has a couple good higher education that would probably be able to, you know, maybe Massachusetts could really be the emerging leader in research on cannabis and help explain what the benefits are both medicinally and what the effects are for recreational and adult use.
Sure. Mike?
Speaking to fellow entrepreneurs who are seeking to get into this space, I mean, I could talk about this for hours and hours and have. In a nutshell, I think that in order to be successful in regulated cannabis going forward, the principles of transparency, of engagement with the community are absolutely critical. But I also think I would reiterate this idea that we don't talk about very often, and that is that, you know, regulated cannabis, I speak about our industry or the industry that I'm in as regulated cannabis, and that's a subset of a larger, what I would call cannabis community. And I think that, you know, a lot of companies that seek to get into the regulated cannabis industry are looking to make as much money as they can, to scrape pennies off the table. They see there's a lot of fortune there. I would say that it would behoove us all as regulated cannabis industry participants to remember that there has been this larger cannabis community for many, many years prior. A lot of our success depends on the activity that they were engaged in before we got here. And to try to, you know, and in our society today, one can get away with just, you know, not looking back, just looking forward and trying to scrape those pennies. I would encourage folks not to look the other way and to embrace the sort of ideals of the cannabis community in this way, in the way that we're talking about today, leveraging your success to try to lift all boats.
Right.
Okay, well, when I was thinking about this program, the first thing that immediately struck me was that many of the communities that we deal with would be uncomfortable thinking of themselves as being cannabis forward. Many of our communities are think of themselves as family-oriented communities with primarily residential in nature, and so I did a little taxonomy. Of our 8 towns, I came into 6 categories. One town, I think, is in the business of actively soliciting cannabis businesses for the town. Another is, I'm going to say, hoping that that's going to happen. A third is a town that was actually a no community, but nevertheless found itself in the situation where one of their first families got involved in in a marijuana facility, and suddenly the town is interested, notwithstanding the fact that it was a no community, in working with a favored business. We've got another town that I'd say is setting the stage for a business in case one comes along, but it's not really in the business of business development at all. And then the others are either making it difficult or the ones that I call no communities. Notably, Reading was a no community in the referendum, immediately adopted a zoning prohibition. Wasn't sure in those days whether it was necessary to have a ballot question on, so they did a ballot question, and for good measure they submitted a special act to the legislature to make sure that they'd be allowed to be a no community. Ultimately, it was decided that the special act wasn't actually needed, but that's a hard no community. But the other communities I don't think are hard no communities, and I think what what keeps me up at night, if you will, is thinking about how those people are going to how those communities are going to transition. Because what they are really doing is saying, we're going to let you all be the trailblazers, and once you all have it all figured out, then we'll just come in and develop our own mechanism. So I think that's what's going on there.
Sure. George is one of those trailblazers. What's your advice?
Well, we try, and I, as many probably know, I work for Joe Curtatone, who is a trailblazing mayor in his own way, and we definitely try to be a trailblazing community in many things. This opportunity to discuss marijuana came out at a time where we're actually also trying to rewrite our entire city zoning ordinance. So to the extent there's something that keeps me up at night, it's the fact that I now have to take the zoning we approved, put it into our zoning overhaul, and make sure that when our overhaul hopefully passes this spring, that it doesn't change the intent of anything that we passed a week ago when we passed the zoning map in the districts, going, basically squeezing it into the old ordinance as we are trying desperately to replace it. But that's the challenge of taking on multiple transformational strategies when implementing our citywide planning efforts. And the overhaul is important to us, and marijuana and making it right and doing it right is important to us, and getting them both right is important to us. So that's the thing that keeps me up at night. In terms of a parting thought, I think I have two relatively quick ones. One is that I think I welcome and appreciate the range of diverse strategies that local government in Massachusetts takes to address any challenge that they do, and I think we all learn well from each other, both by our similarities and our differences in our ways of addressing this. In Somerville, our focus has been really looking at how to build strategies that are focused around the equity issues that we discuss so much as we deal with equity issues around housing and around so many other things. Also about our success of small businesses. I think it is both instructive to look at the strategy of regulating cannabis as we regulate alcohol, as the original ballot question asked, and figuring out what that means, while at the same time figuring out how to address the fact that this is a new emerging industry in terms of the regulated cannabis industry. Our alcohol package store industry in Somerville has grown in a way that it is a number of small neighborhood-oriented businesses in little centers of the community here and there. Some of them are very close to schools. There was a substantial discussion amongst our Board of Aldermen about whether or not a marijuana business should be as close to schools as some of our alcohol businesses is. They ended up creating a very small buffer zone, but not as big as some had talked about. With medical, if we had built the buffer zones that were in the original state medical regulation, which said to keep it 500 feet from any place that children congregate, it literally took the entire city of Somerville out of the regulation. So we had to create our own set of rules and supersede that as the state rule allowed us to do. So we have these discussions: where does it work? How is it right? We have walkable schools. How is it going to interact with kids in the community? We've done a substantial step by making sure that we're putting our host community funds towards substance abuse and treatment programs, and we're very focused. Our health director is also very involved both in the prioritization selection process and in the how we spend that money, so that's a substantial effort. The second point I want to make, though, I just want to echo the point from my colleague from Amherst in that I talked a lot about the retail and about the steps around retail. In the midst of passing the zoning and licensing strategy, we made it very, very simple to establish testing, research, and all of kind of the sort of operational side of what will allow us to make this industry work and work better. I do think the combination of entrepreneurial spirit and technical know-how that exists in Massachusetts positions us very well to be a leader in the role of marijuana research and actually understanding what marijuana is, what it does, how it can help, how it can work, what it can do. I mean, just surrounding us in Somerville, we have some of the greatest biotech minds in the world. Making it easy to establish a marijuana research facility. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know what funding source is available to pay for it. I don't know how that's going to come together yet, but we definitely wanted to establish, all of the strategies surrounding the steps to open a retail facility. We still did a licensing step, and we still did a step surrounding zoning, although for the most part, if a research facility is allowed in a district, a marijuana research facility is allowed in a district, we're trying to open up the community, and I'm hoping we have the opportunity to open up the state, because I really do think that that's an interesting place that we could grow and be a leader, and I hope the entire state's able to benefit from that.
With just a few minutes left, Sia.
Sure.
Parting thoughts.
Yeah, just a few last things. I mean, if you are an entrepreneur, you're looking into getting into this space, I want to encourage people, you can still be an economic empowerment applicant. You can still be recognized as one. And a lot of these different municipalities, I would encourage you to support the economic empowerment program, support more economic empowerment applicants and co-ops as well. And I think the way I see municipalities creating restrictions, I see kind of each restriction as a brick in an obstacle wall, you know? And so I would encourage folks to meet those restrictions with the assistance that we know is going to be necessary there as we continue to add more restrictions. So I would just encourage you all to think about that. And I would be wrong if I didn't leave without encouraging some of this cannabis taxes to go to people's property taxes. The older folks are, the longer they've lived through cannabis prohibition, and I would argue more years they've had to suffer through cannabis prohibition. The drug wars hurt a lot of people. I live in the Mattapan neighborhood. Gentrification is real. I would love to see these cannabis taxes going to fight gentrification like I think a lot of us were really expecting, you know, and so I think one way to do that is subsidize people's property tax. We know they're in a harmed neighborhood already. And so these are the ways I tend to think about that, and I want to keep those cannabis dollars in those harmed neighborhoods and encourage people from those neighborhoods to take ownership of their local market.
Thank you. Eric?
Just really briefly, I know we're running out of time. To folks both in the municipal sector and in the industry, I would encourage you to think of I know we say it a lot in local politics. Politics is local, and if you're going to try to go into a community, you need to do your research about that community before you spend time and effort on that process, because nothing will scuttle a project quicker than making a misstep that any local attorney would tell you it is a problem. So getting in touch with the people in the community who make those decisions and doing the education piece, whether you're a municipal official who's trying to convince a local board or mayor or board of selectmen or board of aldermen, or whether you're a cannabis industry individual who's trying to convince a municipality to sign up. I think there's a lot of really good evidence about economic development that if presented correctly, it does the sales job for you. And the key would be to find those openings that if you can, to get the ear in a municipality to listen to those discussions. Because I think when you talk about personal property taxes and you talk about increase in highly trained workforce, and you talk about the kind of things like the use of local vendors and the use of a local workforce, these are the things that every single politician in every single municipality in the Commonwealth, that's what they run on. That's what they're telling their constituents every day when they're trying to get elected. And if you feed back that message to them, I think there's a real opportunity as the culture changes to make the sales pitch and allow you to get into some of these communities that are not the 100% yes communities. I think it's worked in Lowell. I think working in other communities, it's just a matter of doing the right sales job.
Sam?
I'll be real brief. All those positive economic impact you bring to the community, on the other hand, your industry will have negative impact on the community as well. So my advice is to be a part of the community, find ways to support your local adolescent substance use prevention efforts that will mitigate a lot of the political opposition. Find a way to support the research program that we just talked about, and not just Amherst. Framingham has a lot of research facility as well. Plug. And as I said, just be a part of the community. Don't just come in and open shops and just think about making a profit. Think about being the part of the community, support local programs.
Commissioner McBride, thank you to our panelists. Concludes this panel.
So this has been recorded. We're going to make it available on our website, and we'll get it up to the Social Law Library as well as to Mass Municipal Association and anyone else who wants it. It should be available within, I think, a couple of weeks. It all depends. I will take Mayor Morse's comment to heart, and we'll try very hard to structure panels that showcase a diversity of interests. But I have to say, I think that these gentlemen and the gentleman that went before them knocked it out of the park. And so I really want to thank this panel and the panel before them for coming here, spending the time, sharing your knowledge and your experience, and it's so appreciated. So thank you very much, and that's it.